Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome our distinguished attendees to this webinar of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. CMRS has had the seminars, has held seminars for the last 20 years. At times they were weekly and then they became monthly. With the COVID pandemic, we turned to a webinar format so as to keep our outreach to the community in Cairo first, but then with our virtual community, our online community, which became spread over the globe. This webinar today, I have the pleasure to welcome to it Dr. Jinan Bastaki from the United Arab Emirates University. Dr. Bastaki will talk to us about the protection of refugees. She will talk about de facto protection measures for de facto refugees, how displaced persons are protected in the United Arab Emirates. Dr. Bastaki is Assistant Professor of International Law, as I said, at the United Arab Emirates University. Her research interests encompass the use of forced migration policy, durable solution for refugees, citizenship, as well as informal measures undertaken by states that are not party to the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. Dr. Bastaki was the winner of the International Institute of Humanitarian Law and the International Committee of Red Crosses 2018 Sanremo New Voices in International Law competition. She was the winner for her paper on nationality-based detention of asylum seekers. As I said, Dr. Bastaki talked to us about the de facto measures for protecting de facto refugees in the United Arab Emirates, one of the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which have not ratified the 1951 Convention. In fact, few Arab countries have ratified the convention. Despite the fact that the convention was not ratified, that the GCC member states are not party to the 1951 Convention, they have voted for the 2016 New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees, and then for the Global Compact for Refugees in 2018. In her talk, Dr. Bastaki will explain to us the situation of de facto refugees in the UAE. She will certainly tell us what this concept of de facto refugees reflects. She will also talk to us about the role of the UNHCR and the potential impact of the soft law instruments on refugee protection. So now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Jinan Bastaki. She will talk to us for some 30 to 35 minutes, after which I may have a few comments to make, and then the floor will be given to attendees to raise their question. In fact, the attendees are kindly requested to put their questions and comments using the chat function in the platform, and these questions will be relayed to Dr. Bastaki. Dr. Bastaki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, and thank you very much to the Center for Migration at the American University of Cairo for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here to speak about these de facto measures for de facto refugees. I do have a PowerPoint slide to maybe make it easier for the attendees to follow, so I'll share it now. Okay, so I hope it is available to everybody. So the title obviously of the seminar today is, de facto measures for de facto refugees. So why this emphasis on the de facto measures? And so the reason is, as Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, is that the UAE and all of the countries that make up the Gulf Cooperation Council and also many Arab states are not parties to the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. And this, in a sense, helps the states to eschew certain responsibilities for responsibility for refugees. And also it might hide the fact that there are those who are refugees in their country. They're not legally recognized as refugees. However, if one were to undertake, refugee status determination, if one were to apply the definition of a refugee, we would find that that these people they fit the definition of the refugee, just that they're not recognized as such. Now, of course, there's other measures, even if these states and, and the UAE in particular, but in general, states that are not party to the 1951 Convention, even if they're not party to the 1951 Convention, they still have certain international law rules that apply to them. And one of the most important ones, obviously, is the right to non-refoulement, so that they cannot send back a person who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted. And so these states, they end up becoming, or these people, the de facto refugees, they're in limbo. Because if the state recognizes that they cannot deport them because they have, violated their visa stay, for example, yet at the same time, they're not being recognized as refugees. These people end up being in limbo in the states that they find themselves in. And for the UAE in particular, people who do overstay their visa, the majority of them, unless there is, some, perhaps like a criminal issue or something like that, they're not even, detained. So they end up being, without status in the states that they're in, unable, in a sense, the state is unable to deport them, even though it might want to deport them. But at the same time, they do not have a status where they are. So before discussing, what are the de facto measures that the UAE in particular, but the Gulf countries, more generally, what are the measures that they have implemented to regularize the status of refugees without calling them refugees? Because this is very important, right? There's definitely a huge push to avoid any kind of labeling that might make these states legally responsible. When it's de facto measures, it's, well, okay, it's for this group of people, it's just for this person, it's not something that is official, and therefore the state cannot be bound by it. So before discussing the de facto measures that are in place today, I want to discuss one, perhaps a turning point, particularly in the Gulf region, that resulted in a number of refugees, even though perhaps they were never conceptualized as such. And so this this turning point, you could say, was the invasion of Kuwait in the summer in August of 1990 until February of 1991. And obviously during this time, there were many people many who fled Kuwait. Even at that time, majority of the residents who were living in Kuwait were were non-nationals. Many of them Palestinians, many of them Jordanian Palestinians. So many of them returned to Jordan. And because the non-residents, because they carried a certain, citizenship or a nationality, many were able to, in a sense, go back to those states. However, with the Kuwaitis themselves, some of whom fled to the neighboring countries. And as we said, these neighboring countries did not have any kind of system for registering refugees, did not have any kind of laws set in place to support refugees. However, what the Kuwaitis, the displaced Kuwaitis who fled the invasion in Kuwait, what they did benefit from was a GCC-wide law that is, in a sense, you can liken it to the EU, where you have visa-free travel. So, you can travel to any Gulf state if you're a Gulf national. And not only that, you are treated almost on par with citizens of that Gulf state. So, certain things that might not apply, like, in some GCC countries, if you're a national, you can apply for land, for example. If you're a GCC national, it's not like you can, claim land. But in terms of going to that country, seeking a job in that country, all of these things were actually open to those people. Now, of course, if you think about it, if somebody's fleeing from that country, sometimes they might come with their wealth and sometimes they might not. So there were de facto measures that were enacted very quickly at that time. Schools were opened to the displaced Kuwaitis. Accommodation was actually provided. So even though the Kuwaiti government in exile, they provided a stipend or a salary to the Kuwaitis who were displaced outside, and who many of them were in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, some in Qatar, but the largest numbers went to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Even though they did have, the stipend, in Saudi Arabia, they housed them in apartment complexes and hotels. In the UAE, they were able to, stay in homes and attend schools, and were also given this one-off stipend for being there. So you can see that in a very short period of time, there was de facto measures. And like I said, this isn't something that was written in the law. But in order to face this situation, they enacted all of these measures in order to ensure that these displaced Kuwaitis were able to reside in these countries. Now, obviously, this situation was quite unique because the stay of the displaced Kuwaitis was truly temporary. Very few ended up staying. And even if they did, as we said, they're allowed to stay. They don't even have to apply for the citizenship. They can live here as citizens, but the majority went back after February of 1991. The other, kind of the unique aspects of it was that the Gulf countries were obviously very much allied with Kuwait, were very much afraid of, further perhaps expansionist policies of Iraq. So there was this sense of solidarity at that time. And so this obviously helped, right? We see sometimes in many different situations that sometimes refugees are welcomed when they first kind of come to a country because there's some sense of solidarity. But then as time goes on, especially if the numbers of people is quite great, then kind of the welcome becomes less pronounced. But in this case, like I said, the numbers were relatively small, in the tens of thousands, or around 10,000, I think, in the UAE, and then tens of thousands in Saudi Arabia. Relative to the local population, this is really a minuscule number. So all of these things helped with the I guess generosity, you could say, of these de facto measures that were taken with regards to refugees. Now, obviously, we fast forward now to the early 2010s, and then the then 2015, 2016, where we saw a large number of people in the world seeking asylum, a lot of people on the move, and particularly then the role of these Gulf states, and again, among them is the UAE, which I'll speak about in more detail. Their role suddenly becomes highlighted in, wait a second, how come the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, how come they are not accepting Syrian refugees? How come they are not accepting Iraqi refugees, for example? And so in terms of the current issues, by the end of 2015, and these numbers I have to say are speculative. There isn't really a registrar of the numbers of Yemenis or the numbers of Syrians in these different countries. And so by the end of 2015, it was reported that around 166,000 Yemenis had fled to the neighboring countries, around 90,000 in the Gulf. Even though, for example, in Saudi Arabia, it's, they say that it's close to perhaps 500,000 Yemenis there as well. But like we said, we don't really have an official count of the numbers of people. With regards to the Syrian situation, it's been suggested that the UAE accepted around 100,000 Syrians, and we're going to talk about what accepted means, making the total number of Syrians approximately 240 to 250,000, because that was the number of Syrians who were living in the UAE prior to the crisis. Again, between 500,000 to 1 million in Saudi Arabia, around 40,000 in Qatar, over 18,000 in Kuwait. So if you start to think, if those people are recent arrivals, if these are people who fled the war, what kind of measures are there to ensure their protection? So, the short answer is officially none. Internally, most of the countries making up the GCC, they don't have laws to regulate the status of refugees, except Qatar, which we're going to talk about, was a very recent law that was passed. Nor do they resettle refugees. They're not resettlement countries. And because, as I mentioned before, that we have this evidence of an increased number of Syrians and Yemenis that have arrived in the GCC, so we should take a step back and be like, okay, so what are these hidden measures or these de facto measures that can be used to protect refugees? Now, first, in terms of just official laws. So as I said, Qatar passed a law. It was called Organizing Political Asylum. It passed this law in 2018. The definition of a refugee is very close to the definition of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. However, the rights perhaps are not as extensive. There are many some restrictions on the freedom of expression of refugees, and this was kind of critiqued. But if one looks at the context, I mean, freedom of expression is quite limited in these states anyway, perhaps with the exception of Kuwait. But in the majority of the Gulf states, freedom of expression is restricted, and so it's in a sense not a surprise that the Qatari law kind of it included this very specific restriction on the freedom of expression of refugees. Now, I'm going to talk about the UAE last. I'll speak about Saudi Arabia first. So Saudi Arabia, they provided the 6-month visa to more than, to 465,000 Yemenis to regulate their stay in the country. And they also, they had this new system where temporary work permits were allowed specifically for Syrians and Yemenis. And Syrian children were allowed to go to government schools. And again, there aren't a lot of numbers. There isn't a lot of information on the numbers. It was reported in the first week that 650 temporary work permits were issued to Syrians. But if you want to do more research to find out how many are issued today, was this just an initiative for that time? There isn't actually much information on it. But these are some of the temporary measures that were instated to temporarily, you can liken it to a temporary protection regime, that it's a temporary measure. Now, the UAE did something that was quite interesting. And they, in 2018, they offered firstly a general amnesty for people who were overstaying their residency permits. So that wasn't specific to, refugees or de facto refugees. There was a general amnesty. If you're overstaying your visa, if you violated the terms of your residency permit, you can, apply for this amnesty. You can either leave and not have to pay any of the fines, or if you've managed to find a job, then you can renew this residency of yours again without penalty or with the reduction of penalty. However, at the very same time, there was a new category that was created. You know, they call it, you know, it was the colloquial name for it was, you know, visa al kawarith, right? So it was called the disaster or the catastrophe visas. And basically what it meant, or those who were eligible were basically people who were coming from disaster-ridden countries. So the countries that were included were Syria, Yemen, and Libya. So by this time, the government was aware that there were many Syrians who, I mean, the profile of the Syrians who are in the UAE, just to give you a bit of background. So you had the Syrians who were there from before, before the, you know, the crisis happened. And when the crisis happened and the war, you know, escalated in Syria, there's like a different, as I said, you know, profiles, but there's one profile or one demographic, which is the male breadwinner of a family whose family is back in Syria. And he's working in a relatively low wage job. However, this low wage job, because, you know, his family is back home and, you know, costs in general are low compared to the UAE, that low paying salary was enough for that male breadwinner in order for him to be able to live here as well as send it back home. So what happened after the crisis, or after, you know, the war in Syria, is that many of these you know, male breadwinners, they ended up bringing their often large families here. And so this family of 5 or of 6 or of 7 or of 8 that was attending school for free in Syria, that was surrounded by extended, you know, family members, that you know, the cost of living was, you know, relatively low compared here to the UAE, who are now bringing their whole families in order to keep them safe. And in a sense, they were met with very few protection measures. And so this category of people, we can call them the family reunification category, they ended up, you know, being allowed to be here. So they had the residencies because they have a male breadwinner here, and so he was, you know, supporting them. At the same time, you suddenly had these children who cannot go to school. And then what happens is, and now especially, you know, because of the pandemic, but even pre-pandemic, when this breadwinner lost his job, he can't go back to Syria. He cannot take his family back to Syria. And they end up being in limbo. And once your residency expires as well, so there's also charities here that can help people who are of low income, whether they are citizens or even non-nationals. But these charities cannot help those who do not have a valid residency permit. And so what happens when the residency expires? There's no job. But the state will not, in general, deport them back to their country. And so this category of people was created here in the UAE. And so in recognition of that, in 2018, the government, they created the specific category, like I mentioned before, visa al kawarith, right? The disaster, the catastrophe visa, for this group of people. And many were able to regularize their status. Now, the issue with this visa was that, and you had to apply within a very specific period of time. There was an extension, but it was, I believe, between August and December of 2018. And then it was closed. And so basically after that, if you have a family that perhaps at that point in time, their residencies were valid and everything was okay, after that time, if they, you know, after that time they lost their jobs, they cannot apply for this residency visa. So in a sense, the protection that they have under these circumstances is simply the right not to be refooled, not to be returned. They are free to look for jobs, and in a sense, that can give them the security. So if someone finds a job, then that is okay. They can, you know, reinstate their residency and also get residency for their children, for their family. However, in the absence of that, you have children who are out of school. You have, you know, people who are living in apartments who can't pay for it. And as well as, again, if their residency has expired, they're unable to approach charities because the charities are not allowed to give them if they are seen that that they don't have this residency. And so, like I mentioned, and the other issue as well is that fees are also very high. So sometimes what happens is a person might find a job and is able to regularize their status, but in order to then, get the permits for their extended family, they have to renew their passport. Renewing the passport, can cost between $300 to $1,000. It depends, like if you want it to be fast tracked or not. So really extortionate kind of prices. And then again, you cannot get your permit renewed if you don't have your passport renewed. So you have all of these issues that de facto refugees are facing. And again, the main protection that they have is the right not to be returned. And then you also have these ad hoc measures that are introduced from time to time. And usually it comes as a surprise. It's not like there's going to be, and you can anticipate. The 2018 amnesty visa came as a surprise. It wasn't, it was announced, and then suddenly you had the scramble of people wanting to apply for it. And so, what is the role of the UNHCR in the UAE, particularly in this context? And so, firstly, the UNHCR, just in general, they have the largest stockpile in Dubai. And so basically a lot of emergency aid kind of comes out from Dubai because the government kind of gave them this space in order to keep, emergency aid. But what the UNHCR also does in the capital, not in Dubai or any of the other Emirates, but in the capital, is that they register asylum seekers. They do undertake, RSD. Now, what does it mean for the UNHCR to kind of do this RSD and register certain asylum seekers? Now, these asylum seekers, they are registered for resettlement purposes. It's not to be, integrated into the host community. It's not in order to be given certain privileges. But this basically it affirms their status as persons who cannot be returned. Because in certain, circumstances, like let's just say if you are from a country, like if outside of, for example, Syria or Libya or Yemen, let's just say it's from a country that is not suffering from a war. If the authorities don't undertake, RSD, then they might, deport someone who is overstaying their visa without knowing whether, they could be a refugee or they could not be. And so what this kind of process does is that it registers them for the resettlement purposes, and it ensures that these people are not deported. The other thing that the UNHCR does is they train government entities to be able to recognize someone who is a de facto refugee. And then the case might be referred to the UNHCR. So in a sense, they're doing this in order to make the authorities aware that there are people who might be de facto refugees, and that they do have certain rights that are enshrined under international law, mainly the right not to be deported. And so now we come to the final part, which is the Global Compact for Refugees. So given all of these these measures that are not really measures, when the UAE was one of the countries that signed on to firstly the 2016 New York Declaration, and they had made an announcement that they would accept 15,000 Syrian refugees over 5 years, but since that time it hasn't really materialized. And they've also adopted the Global Compact for Refugees. And as we know, there are 4 key aims. I'm not going to bore you by going through the details, but you have, easing pressure on host countries, enhancing refugee self-reliance, expanding access to third country solutions, and supporting conditions in country of origin for return in safety and dignity. Now, part of this easing pressures on host countries, the UAE and as well as many, Gulf Arab states, because they're wealthy states, they do support a lot of host communities. So, the UAE administers a camp in Jordan, for example. They support certain, charities as well as the UNHCR in host states. But beyond that, And beyond this announcement in 2016 of accepting 15,000 Syrian refugees, there hasn't actually been many measures that could support or enhance the protection of refugees. And I've put here the pledges so that we can see, in a sense, the nature of, I guess, the role that many of the Gulf states see for themselves under the GCR. So Bahrain, their pledge was to continue financial pledges. Kuwait, again, you can see that it's mostly financial. Oman, there wasn't much. Qatar, pledges related to education and livelihood. Again, these are all monetary. Saudi Arabia implementing GCR in Yemen, UAE continue to support peace and stability, to support refugee women and children. And what's very interesting about these pledges, right? So as we know, the Global Compact website, as the states, they state their pledges, but also what they've done under the compact in order to enhance protection or fulfill the goals of the GCR. Now, like I mentioned before, we had the 2018 amnesty visa. That is something to, you could say, showcase. But that wasn't placed as one of the pledges or one of the achievements of these states. And perhaps the reason is that many of these countries, they don't want the Global Compact, in a sense, to pressure these states to undertake, in a sense, international obligations with regards to the refugees. And so the solution, I've discussed this before, and Dr. Ibrahim, he was there, was, kind of the solution, this hybrid solution of labor migration. And like I said, and particularly now, the focus is the UAE. The UAE is made up of majority expatriates, 88 to 90% expatriates. There's a substantial, reliance on expatriate workers. And so kind of the idea here would be, under the GCR, instead of, trying to pressure certain states to take on certain obligations, which it doesn't seem that the states are ready to do at this moment, it's actually to perhaps frame it in the notion, frame it under the notion of labor migration, that there are certain jobs that need to be filled, and these are people who are able to do these certain jobs. However, the only additional thing is to basically provide these minimum protections, that if we are doing labor migration, so people are working, we will also, if we decide that they fit the definition of refugee, or they, again, the states themselves, they can decide that if you come from a certain country, then you can be recognized under the scheme, that there are minimum protections that can be made available for these people as their families. And so just to conclude that, in many of these states, and in the UAE in particular, there are people who can be considered, de facto refugees. And some of them, who are able to, they might register with the UNHCR in order to be resettled. But as we know, resettlement numbers are very low. The way out for many of these people is actually to find a job. And the jobs are, open to these people as they are to any other expatriate or non-national. And so this is the thing that kind of provides the de facto protection. It's the job, as well as, the international law obligation to not deport. And so in these circumstances, the state itself, like I said, it might instate these ad hoc measures in order to, provide a way for these people to have their status regularized, but it definitely falls short of, refugee status or certain rights that are associated or full protections for this category of people. And so, in a sense, the GCR can provide this opportunity by trying to find alternative ways for protection in these states, because it doesn't seem, at least not from my perspective, that they're going to be ready to, either sign the 1951 convention or to pass their own domestic laws that provide these, far-reaching protections for refugees. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
I kept to the 30-minute mark.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting indeed. I listened to your presentation of these ideas in Geneva. I think it was probably 18 months ago, before COVID. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was on the occasion of the review of GDCR. So let me, before I take up questions from attendees, let me try to identify what you suggest and what the frame that you draw. First, you have the concept of de facto refugees. De facto, it's interesting. It's an interesting concept because I think it's a solution for a problem that has found people working in the refugee field somehow uncomfortable, and they resorted to the concept of forced migration and forced migrants. In fact, what you say is that those seeking protection, whether they are recognized as refugees or not, whether their applications for asylum are recognized or not, these are de facto refugees. But in fact, you have these in Lebanon, where refugees have stopped being registered. You have them in Turkey, where asylum seekers have stopped being registered. So you are crafting a new concept, which is an interesting concept, even if I doubt that states will accept it very, very willingly. My second comment is about what you propose as labor migration, as a way, short of being party to the convention and short of applying the provisions of the convention. So why not resort to labor migration, which is, I think, an interesting idea. Because, in some states that are parties to the 1951 convention, some asylum seekers are recognized as refugees, and yet they cannot work. So before the law, they are fine. But in reality, they are not. So at first sight, it would seem that there is such a difference. In fact, there is not really such a difference, because when you say that some individuals would find themselves with no status at all. In fact, this happens in countries that are parties. Because, for instance, in Egypt, you have those that are called closed-file refugees. The files are closed, and yet they are not deported. So they remain in the state without any sort of status. So it's an interesting idea. Let me just say at the end of my comments that what you propose, what you have told us first, is that the labor migration regime in a country such as UAE is not really applied 100%. Because even low-paid workers can bring in their funds, which is not the case for other low-paid workers. So this is, I think, a sort of a waiver. And the second waiver, which is important, is that those individuals that need protection are allowed to seek jobs, to look for jobs in the labor market. So there is some sort of mobility in the labor market, which is a departure from the kafala system, which is quite interesting. In fact, in a way, Bahrain has introduced this change. Qatar is introducing this change, but this is quite an interesting. Let's hope that this is the first step. that it applies also to other workers, in particular low-skilled workers, because this is not only in the interest of workers, it's in the interest of the state themselves. Because when you allow mobility of workers, you're allowing mobility of workers who already know the labor markets, rather than sending them back to their countries of origin and then bring others. And this will include the flexibility of labor markets. So you are bringing together norms governing international labor migration with norms governing refugees. In many cases, we have said that even though refugees have on paper protection under international law, which is higher than that provided for migrants, we also say that very often one and the same person can be a refugee and can be a migrant. You cannot really distinguish between the two states. I'm sorry, I've been quite long, but your intervention was quite interesting. So let me see if there are any questions, any comments. No questions have been written in the chat function, and in this case, those of you who would like the floor, I'll give the floor to those who would like to speak. Who would like to raise a comment or to raise a question or to make a comment? I can see that Elena Habersky is here. No one would like, no questions, no comments? Well, in this case, let me ask Jinan Bastek, what do you think? How can you react to my understanding of what you said?
So absolutely, I agree with you, and I do kind of use firstly your first comment about de facto kind of refugees, and I think the reason why I didn't say forced migrants and I said de facto refugees is, I guess, just legally, and obviously my background is in law, we recognize that refugees have certain rights. We might not understand that a forced migrant has certain rights. And so for me, I kind of want to make it clear that, these are people who, fit the definition of a refugee. And that they should be protected. Their responsibility in a sense of the international system, and so this is kind of the way I frame it as de facto measures for de facto refugees, because the term refugee, at least from a legal standpoint, it implies with it, certain rights and certain protections. And so this is why I kind of, I use that framing in the presentation. And with regards to your second, point about, labor migration and workers' rights and so on and so forth, like I think, being, back here, I spent many years abroad, and now being back here in the UAE for about 4 or 5 years, there's actually been a lot, many changes to the labor laws, and many changes as well as with regards to people coming on visit visas, and then through that finding jobs. So you can transfer, initially, I think, this was, maybe a decade or more than a decade ago, that if you were to change, from one employer to another, or you were here on a certain type of visa, and then you have to change it to another type of visa, you'd have to leave. And, many would go to, I think it was the island of Kishk or something, because like it's at half an hour, flight away or something like that, and then to be able to come back. Whereas now, like you said, there is a bit more mobility, because firstly, as you said, people here, if you find another job, you can just transfer that visa. Not only that, even if you lose your job, you still have, I guess you could call it a grace period, where there isn't a penalty. It's not like you lost your job today and you have to leave next week. There is still a period of time that I believe is renewable. And also, you can be somebody who visits from abroad, and it's a visit visa. You're here on vacation, but you could also find a job. And actually, from the Syrians that I interviewed here, who have now been here since 2012, for example, right? It's like literally like 9 years. But they came after the start of the hostilities, depending where they were from, and they didn't come here on a work visa. They came here on a visit visa. Maybe they had family members. Others, maybe they came that it was a holiday, right? Which it wasn't really a holiday. It was kind of like a job seeking kind of venture. And once they found it, they stayed here, and then they transferred that visa. They changed it from a visit visa to a work permit to a work visa. And I think also with regards to, in a sense, this like labor migration, framework, is that aside from some kind of political issues at certain times when certain people from certain countries might be blocked, for the most part, in many different times, Syrians were, again, this my understanding from my interviews with Syrians who were able to come here, that at the times when they were open, people were allowed to apply for a visa and come. There were, as I said, some kinds of political issues at certain points where the visas, were shut from certain countries, Syria being one of them at a certain point, but then they open again. And so even in that case, like that is, in a sense, perhaps not a door that is wide open, but it's open enough that people can get their foot in. So this helps with this whole labor migration thing. Obviously, the only the issue with the labor migration framework is to remember that as we said, refugees can be migrants as well. You can have this mix of statuses, but to also remember that they are also refugees, and there's something to always keep in mind, that they do need certain protections that an economic migrant might not need. Perhaps the economic migrant, if they go back to their country, the issues are poverty, for example, which is obviously, it is a huge issue. But the refugee, it's persecution, it's death, it's war. And so to always remember that in that labor migration framework, that there has to be this protection. And obviously, for what I think that is the most difficult part to get states to agree to, simply because it, again, from my perspective, it seems that the states want to avoid having any official obligations to accept refugees. And so a labor migration framework that says you have to do XYZ, that might be a bit difficult. However, there is already this framework that exists that allows anybody coming from abroad to apply for a job, and if they get it, then they can stay, and then the states are bound to not deport. So there are definitely issues. This isn't like a solution that is going to solve all of these problems, and there are many problems within the solution itself, but it's definitely, I would see, a way forward out of this deadlock where we're not part of the 1951 convention, therefore there's no responsibility whatsoever, and the only responsibility is kind of this external aid, to kind of at least have this mechanism whereby people can live dignified lives, work as they want, and like you said, somebody can be recognized as a refugee in another place and not be allowed the right to work, and so kind of provide this opportunity. So it's still definitely an idea that has to be developed more, given the circumstances in different states, but for me, kind of within the GCR, framework, and what I see and the research that I've done here in the UAE, it seems to be, the most plausible way that refugees can get this kind of this de facto protection.
Thank you. Let me react to your very useful addition. Again, I think that this is a very interesting concept, de facto refugee, and I understand the emphasis on the rights of individuals seeking protection, and certainly forced migration is a very doubtful concept, frankly, because most migration is not really voluntary. Most migration is not voluntary. domestic workers who leave their families and their children behind. Is this really voluntary? So frankly, it's a very doubtful concept. So this is a welcome concept that you have crafted. With regard to obligations, you know, even states that have not become parties to the convention, take Lebanon and Georgia, they carry out also some fun, because protection is not only allowing individuals seeking asylum to stay in the country. You have to take care of their education, you have to take care of their health, because if you don't take care of their health in a pandemic, for instance, you are threatening your whole population. So the question is that, for instance, Lebanon relies to a great extent on international cooperation, because Lebanon as such is not in a position to meet all its protection obligations, which is not the case in the GCC. In fact, the GCC also contribute, as we said, for instance, UAE has a camp or finances a camp in Jordan. So this is a way of providing protection, which is provided for in the 1951 Convention, without really specifics about what protection should be, or the form it should take. So yes, I agree with you that this is not a solution. This is probably a contribution to some form of protection for refugees in an international system and in the regional system, which has quite a few shortcomings. So yes, why not consider it? And then, of course, the additional flexibility that has been introduced to the functioning of labor markets in the Gulf for different reasons, we know, in the last 10 to 15 years, may also contribute to this protection. So, as you said, states do not want to be to any legally binding text. And of course, the Gulf states in particular are not very friendly with legally binding conventions, whether 1951 Convention or the human rights instruments or others. And by the way, they are not alone. Others also are,
of course,
in the same situation. Would you have anything to add, please? Do you have any addition to what you've just said? I have very much enjoyed, and I'm certain our audience has also enjoyed your intervention and the discussion. And if you have anything, I would be gladly listening to your closing remarks.
No, thank you so much. I think I've said, most of what I've said. I've listened. I've enjoyed your comments as well, which I feel like I definitely want to take forward and kind of think more about. And absolutely, thank you for inviting me to the seminar. It was definitely very. It was nice to see you again and to present. And I'm always happy to be given the opportunity to present about this issue, because it also helps me to think about it in a sense more and to have these discussions. So thank you very much.
We all challenge each other into doing more thinking, and we're very happy to have you for a second time. This is your second event. I think we had an event in March, was it, or in February? In January, right? In
January, I think it was, yeah.
In January. It was the 70th anniversary of UNHCR status, the statute of UNHCR. So thank you very much for having accepted our invitation and for your very interesting presentation, interesting ideas, and we'll be in contact with you, and we would like to engage you more and more in the activities of CMRS. Let me also thank our audience for being here with us. We will keep organizing our webinars for the benefit of the communities which have now expanded. It's not only the Cairo community, it is a virtual community. Thank you all very much, and I hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you so much.
Bye-bye. So you have here a comment from Ellen Habersky for your interesting presentation. She thanks you for your interesting presentation.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.